8 September 1944, south of Metz, near the Moselle River, the headquarters of the U.S. Third Army received intelligence updates concerning a German-held fortress complex that had been bypassed but not yet neutralized. The staff officers reviewing the reports operated within the established command logic of the 9th U.S. Army Group, which emphasized uninterrupted momentum toward the German frontier rather than protracted assaults on isolated strongpoints. Yet some within the corps-level planning staff quietly questioned whether institutional impatience, learned over 2 months of rapid movement from Normandy to the Moselle, was obscuring the psychological variables that accompany encircled defenders. There was no consensus at the table, only an implicit tension between speed and caution, between presumption of collapse and the possibility of hard, localized resistance. No one predicted a turning point. They saw instead a practical dilemma about resource allocation, time, and leadership risk, whose consequences would unfold before anyone could fully recalibrate their assumptions. The outer context of this moment had formed weeks earlier. After the breakout from Normandy in early August 1944, the U.S. Third Army under Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. moved faster than most Allied logistical models anticipated. Past experience, both American and German, suggested that rapid exploitation after a breakthrough often induced enemy withdrawal before positions could harden. Senior Allied headquarters had internalized this pattern since the opening of Operation Cobra, and no major operational planner in September viewed isolated German positions in eastern France as strategically decisive. Instead, they were treated as friction, expected to slow movement but not alter the larger trajectory of the campaign toward the German frontier. This framing appeared rational at the time. Institutional memory from the 1918 offensives and more recent North African and Sicilian campaigns reinforced the idea that bypassed enemy garrisons were less a threat than a nuisance. The German army, while still tactically proficient, showed signs of exhaustion and organizational trauma. For the Third Army's G2 branch, the intelligence picture indicated degradation of German command coherence after the collapse of Army Group B in the Falaise pocket during late August. This created a perception, shared by many Allied analysts, that the German defensive line in Lorraine lacked unified intention. In that climate, American planners expected localized attempts at delay, not ideological last stands. However, fortress garrisons were a special category within the German military system. Many were led by mid-level officers trained to interpret hold-at-all-costs orders through the lens of national survival rather than battlefield pragmatism. From the German perspective, Metz and its satellite forts represented not only defensive positions but symbolic barriers marking the threshold of the Reich. The fortress complexes dated back to the Franco-Prussian War and had been reinforced by French military engineering before 1940. Though technologically outdated against modern air and artillery power, they carried institutional meaning for German officers shaped by frontier geography and the memory of 1914. American staff officers understood the geography. They underestimated the psychology. Inside the American Third Army staff meetings, the main concern was tempo. Patton's operational method depended on momentum and intimidation, not attritional siege tactics. Bypassing the fortress would satisfy the broader operational requirement, but leaving a garrison behind risked harassment of supply columns and rear area disruption. Conversely, conducting a deliberate siege would consume artillery stocks and aviation sorties better used for forward movement. This produced a cognitive dilemma. Should the fortress be treated as a military problem, a logistical problem, or a psychological problem? Each classification implied different resource costs and different risks. By the time American armored elements tightened their encirclement around the German-held position in early September, the staff still defaulted to the assumption that a formal surrender would follow once escape became impossible. That assumption rested not on wishful thinking, but on precedent. Hundreds of German soldiers across France had surrendered under similar conditions across July and August. It was therefore logical, even responsible, to offer surrender terms before committing to destructive means. What was not yet visible to the Americans was that the garrison's commanding major interpreted surrender very differently. For him, capitulation was not a cost-saving maneuver, but a violation of duty. How those conflicting interpretations met in the narrow space of a fortress corridor would soon determine the character of the engagement. Decisions already set in motion would accelerate before anyone could adjust, and the consequences would spread far beyond the walls of that fort. Frontline observations and fragmented signals shaped the American assessment as infantry and armored reconnaissance units completed the physical encirclement. Patrols reported that the garrison was disciplined but static, with limited signs of counterattack preparation. Radio intercepts yielded no evidence of coordinated German relief efforts in the Metz area, reinforcing the belief within Third Army intelligence that the fortress was an isolated pocket rather than a node in a larger defensive scheme. Yet ambiguity persisted. The quality of German mid-level leadership in September 1944 varied widely, and reports struggled to distinguish defeated formations from those that retained cohesion and purpose. Analysts noted the presence of officers wearing pre-war insignia, but the significance of that detail was unclear. Such officers might indicate professionalism and willingness to negotiate, or conversely, ideological rigidity and readiness to die in place. With no reliable psychological profile, the Americans defaulted to material indicators, ammunition reserves, water supply, and the absence of German armor, criteria that historically predicted quick collapse. Within the fortress, the German major commanding the position evaluated the situation through his own institutional filters. His decision-making authority rested not only on operational orders, but on a culture of command shaped by the Wehrmacht's doctrine of Auftragstaktik, initiative within the framework of intent. The written directives from higher headquarters in Metz were sparse, emphasizing delay and resistance without specifying duration or acceptable loss levels. That ambiguity granted local commanders wide latitude. To an American analyst, such vagueness suggested that surrender might be permissible once resistance achieved symbolic delay. To a German officer steeped in the language of honor and fortified defense, the same vagueness implied expectation rather than leniency. The Americans did not know his personal interpretation. He did not know theirs. As the surrender offer was drafted by American officers on the perimeter, its structure reflected U.S. Army procedural norms, clarity, brevity, and an implicit assumption that rational actors would choose survival over annihilation. The message warned of encirclement, noted the availability of humane treatment under the Geneva Convention, and offered a short deadline for response. It was a calibrated instrument of psychological pressure, standard for the theater, and grounded in recent experience with German withdrawals. The Americans believed it demonstrated professionalism. The German major perceived it as condescension. The reply, delivered verbally through an intermediary, was not irrational within its own framework. The major asserted that his duty was to hold the fortress and that if Patton wanted it, he would have to kill him. American officers interpreted the statement as bravado rather than policy. They expected calculation to replace defiance once shelling commenced. This expectation aligned with Allied assessments that the German army, after the trauma of the Falaise pocket, now prioritized force preservation over suicidal gestures. The flaw in that logic was not in the data, but in the assumed generality. Pockets of ideological or professional rigidity existed, and when placed in terrain associated with national symbolism and military pride, they operated outside the statistical average. Patton's awareness of the exchange was filtered through staff summaries. He rarely interacted directly with surrendered garrisons during active operations, relying instead on tempo and overwhelming firepower to expedite outcomes. His strategic calculus at this moment was straightforward. Delay threatened momentum toward the Saar, and indulgent negotiation would signal weakness. Staff diaries suggest he viewed refusal of surrender not as insanity, but as miscalculation, an error that could be corrected by demonstrating that resistance increased rather than decreased destruction. To him, the German major's statement revealed a decision point. The fortress commander had declared a preference hierarchy, honor above survival, and Patton answered within his own hierarchy, speed above negotiation. Aviation units assigned to the Third Army assessed the target environment with limited visibility. Weather over the Moselle corridor was variable, and forward observers struggled to map bunker apertures and subterranean galleries. The intelligence picture, therefore, contained gaps regarding structural endurance, personnel distribution, and killbox geometry. Yet, from an operational standpoint, exact precision was unnecessary. The American plan did not assume surgical destruction, but psychological breakage. In earlier engagements across France, airstrikes combined with artillery produced sufficient shock to compel surrender, often within hours. These precedents informed the American judgment. Refusal now did not imply refusal later. What neither side recognized was how the interaction of doctrinal assumptions, fragmented intelligence, and localized leadership psychology would compress the decision timeline. The German major believed time favored meaning. The Americans believed time favored annihilation. Within that collision of interpretations lay the reason the fortress would not survive the day. Shortly after the surrender offer was rejected, American field commanders transitioned from negotiation to execution without ceremony. The encirclement ring tightened as infantry companies repositioned to block potential breakout routes, while armored elements shifted to interdiction points along narrow country roads south of the fortress. The operational tempo was deliberate but unhesitating. Units were not rushed, but were not allowed to idle, a pattern characteristic of American tactical doctrine by late 1944. At the corps level, the decision to apply artillery before committing ground assault reflected an institutional desire to minimize infantry casualties, a priority that emerged from the bitter lessons of hedgerow fighting in Normandy. Thus, the opening stage of the assault followed a predictable rhythm: suppress, isolate, disorient. Light and medium artillery batteries began registering targets along visible bunkers and trench lines. Forward observers perched on ridges west of the position called in corrections as rounds bracketed the fortress. The bombardment was not intended to destroy the deep structures outright, which would have required a prolonged siege, but to degrade peripheral positions, compromise morale, and force the garrison into interior spaces where communication would be harder. The garrison, prepared for bombardment, retreated into galleries and fortified chambers. Survival was possible, but situational awareness declined sharply. In darkness and smoke, cohesion depends on more than discipline. It depends on information flow. At this stage, the German commander still interpreted his environment as controlled. He could hear detonations, but not observe American maneuver, leading him to assume the fortress served its intended purpose, absorbing punishment. Air support arrived after artillery had shaped the battlefield. Fighter bombers made low passes, dropping fragmentation bombs along the upper works and access routes. These strikes served two operational functions. First, they restricted movement, preventing the garrison from shifting men or supplies between strongpoints. Second, they reinforced to the German troops that the Americans controlled the vertical dimension, a psychological marker that erodes the defender's sense of reciprocal agency. In many Wehrmacht reports from 1943 onward, loss of air parity is cited as the point when defenders ceased to believe they could influence the battle's tempo. Here, too, such an effect was plausible. The fortress was not collapsing physically, but it was shrinking cognitively. American infantry tested the perimeter cautiously, probing for weak points, without committing to a full breach. This behavior reflected a refined tactical culture. American commanders by late 1944 had learned to avoid frontal assaults on intact fortifications unless suppressive fires had disrupted defenders. When small arms fire emerged from slit windows and firing apertures, the infantry withdrew without agitation. They were not interested in trading bodies for ramparts. They were confirming that resistance remained organized. The Germans interpreted these probes as signs that the Americans feared storming the walls. In fact, the Americans were simply following doctrine. Patton, receiving periodic updates through staff channels, responded to the refusal of surrender not with emotional escalation, but with administrative acceleration. He approved concentration of additional artillery assets and authorized flexible use of air sorties within the core zone. To outside observers, such decisions might appear habitual aggression. Within the logic of Third Army operations, they were pragmatic risk management. Every hour spent negotiating or testing defenses jeopardized the broader movement toward the German frontier. Applying overwhelming power early reduced uncertainty later. In military psychology, this is deterrence through demonstration. Inside the fortress, behavior shifted as the garrison absorbed sustained attack. Runners replaced telephones in certain sectors, indicating structural or electrical disruption. Sections sealed blast doors, limiting lateral movement and fracturing the internal command picture. The German major issued instructions emphasizing endurance, not maneuver. He believed that American forces would not commit to an infantry assault without a visible breach, and that such a breach would require time Americans did not wish to spend. He was correct in his understanding of siege logic, but incorrect in his timeline expectations. Hours into the assault, American ground elements expanded the encirclement to include support routes and fallback positions. Engineers laid obstacles and mines on likely breakout paths. The intent was not to prevent escape entirely, but to shape movement, directing any attempted sortie into pre-planned kill zones. This was not an emotional reaction to defiance. It was the measured application of battlefield geometry. A fortress that cannot maneuver is not a fortress. It is a container. As the day progressed, the cumulative pressure of artillery, aviation, and encirclement produced tangible degradation. Ammunition within the fortress was finite, medical stations became crowded, and water supplies were at risk. None of these factors alone compelled surrender, but their combined weight eroded the German major's strategic model. He had expected punishment and endurance. He had not adequately anticipated isolation and acceleration. In this environment, American decisions multiplied and German decisions narrowed. And once that asymmetry took form, the outcome ceased to depend on will. Momentum in the outer ring created a quiet shift in understanding among American field officers. Initial confidence that the fortress would capitulate after demonstration fires began to erode, not because resistance was tactically effective, but because its continuity suggested a different motivational structure than anticipated. Reports from forward observers noted organized return fire from fixed positions even after sustained bombardment, which implied that the German major retained both authority and communication. This was not the fraying performance of a defeated unit awaiting an opportunity to surrender. It resembled the posture of a commander who had reinterpreted the tactical situation as a moral test. The Americans did not admire this shift, nor did they disparage it. They registered it as a variable requiring recalculation. At Corps headquarters, staff discussions reflected ambivalence. On one hand, they believed the tactical end state was assured. The fortress could not resist indefinitely, and German relief formations lacked the strength to intervene. On the other hand, they confronted the possibility that the defenders' psychological threshold differed from the standard patterns identified in recent operations. War diaries from September 1944 occasionally noted such anomalies, but treated them as curiosities rather than planning factors. Now the anomaly dictated tempo. Quietly, staff officers adjusted expectations from surrender after bombardment to surrender after degradation, a subtle but important distinction. Degradation implied incremental attrition of resources, morale, and structural integrity, factors that require time and observation rather than scripted pressure. Among the garrison, a reciprocal shift occurred. The major's initial certainty that the fortress's symbolic value would deter American commitment began to waver as bombardment intensified without pause. His working assumption had been that Americans preferred clean encirclement and negotiation over destruction of fortified positions. This assumption derived partly from earlier campaigns in Tunisia and Italy, where Allied forces often demonstrated reluctance to waste shells and sorties on minor objectives. What he failed to account for was the altered strategic environment of September 1944. Patton's operational mandate prioritized speed toward the German border, and demonstrating that refusal accelerated destruction served that mandate. The major observed explosions and collapse in satellite strongpoints and recognized that the Americans were not waiting for exhaustion, they were inducing it. Secondary effects accumulated. Communications between bunker clusters became unreliable. Medical staff struggled to treat blast injuries in confined spaces. Some junior NCOs recommended consolidation into deeper galleries to preserve manpower, but doing so reduced fields of fire and ceded tactical initiative. The major chose to maintain outer positions as long as feasible, believing that visible resistance might still encourage negotiation. This decision preserved symbolic posture, but at the cost of personnel and coordination. In the confined geometry of fortified positions, symbolism and utility rarely remain aligned. American interrogations of prisoners taken during perimeter probes provided new intelligence. Several captured soldiers indicated that the garrison had limited water and that internal morale was uneven. None suggested the major would surrender, but their accounts confirmed that the fortress operated less as a cohesive unit and more as a network of semi-isolated cells under directional influence. This clarified the American picture. The obstacle was not the fortress itself, it was the commander's interpretation of duty. Eliminating that node, whether through death, incapacitation, or removal of command influence, would likely cause collapse. This was not a moral judgment, it was an inference consistent with Wehrmacht command culture. Within Third Army headquarters, Patton adjusted his view as information filtered upward. Staff notes suggest he regarded the German major's position not as fanaticism, but miscalculation shaped by outdated fortress doctrine. Patton had long believed that wars of movement punished static thinking, and here he saw confirmation. He reportedly remarked that if the man wished to die in his fortress, he would assist him.
The statement was not a threat, but an acknowledgement that decision space had narrowed. Refusal to surrender was not an invitation to heroic siege warfare. It was a logistical inconvenience to be cleared. As evening approached, a perceptible change in the soundscape around the fortress indicated structural stress. Bunkers that once emitted steady machine gun bursts fell silent or fired sporadically. Spotters observed smoke venting from ventilation shafts, implying internal fires or compromised air circulation. These were not decisive failures, but cumulative warnings. To the Americans, they signaled conditions favoring surrender. To the German major, they validated his belief that his stand possessed symbolic weight. Yet, amid these contrasting interpretations, a quiet convergence formed. Both sides recognized that negotiation would no longer determine the outcome. The Americans believed force would compel surrender. The German major believed destruction would preserve honor. Each side's logic remained internally coherent, but coherence no longer implied viability. The fortress was becoming an abstraction sustained by a single officer's conviction. Once that conviction ceased to translate into organized resistance, its meaning would collapse with it.
Nightfall compressed decisions into shorter intervals. As darkness settled over the Moselle corridor, American batteries shifted to periodic illumination rounds, revealing the fortress perimeter in stark flashes as engineers and infantry repositioned. The Corps commander authorized additional artillery ammunition expenditure, unconcerned about long-term stockpiles because supply lines from Nancy and Verdun remained intact. This decision, logistically mundane, carried strategic implications. It signaled that the Americans no longer sought a calibrated psychological effect, but instead aimed to produce systemic breakdown before dawn. The shift reflected a broader doctrinal lesson learned since Normandy. When uncertainty about a defender's threshold persists, overwhelming pressure is often the cheapest solution in lives and time. Within the fortress, the German major evaluated his situation under deteriorating informational conditions. Telephone lines between galleries had been severed in multiple sectors, forcing reliance on runners who moved through smoke-filled corridors. Enemy movement outside could not be observed, only inferred from sound and vibration. Reports from outer bunkers were contradictory. Some claimed that American infantry was preparing for an assault. Others insisted that artillery alone was shaping the battlefield. The major attempted to synthesize these fragments into a coherent picture, but faced a cognitive barrier inherent to defensive confinement. The defender sees only what enters, while the attacker sees everything that surrounds. This asymmetry converts incomplete data into flawed certainty. Shortly before midnight, American officers debated whether a direct infantry assault would accelerate the end state or incur unnecessary losses. The risk calculus tilted toward patience. The fortress showed signs of internal stress, and the refusal to surrender did not imply immunity to collapse. Moreover, the Americans recognized that killing the garrison was not the objective. The objective was to eliminate it as a functional unit. Surrender would satisfy that objective. Destruction was simply an acceptable alternative. The distinction was procedural, not emotional, and it guided decisions throughout the night. Air support diminished after dusk due to visibility constraints, shifting the burden onto artillery and engineering assets. Counter-battery fire from the fortress was sporadic and largely ineffective, suggesting ammunition conservation or organizational strain. American observers interpreted this reduction not as a sign of imminent collapse, but as controlled rationing by a competent commander. This interpretation underscored a recurring analytical dilemma. The same behavior could indicate discipline or desperation. Without visibility into internal conditions, American assessments remained probabilistic.
Toward the early morning hours, fragmentation grenades and satchel charges were used by American engineers to neutralize outlying pillboxes. These actions were small in scale, but strategically significant. Each neutralized position narrowed the garrison's tactical footprint and increased the proportion of troops confined in interior galleries. The German major understood the implication. A fortress subdivided into smaller compartments loses mobility and mutual support, becoming a collection of isolated strongpoints that cannot influence each other. Once compartmentalization reaches a critical threshold, the garrison ceases to function as a command-driven force and becomes a set of individual survival nodes. Inside the command galleries, the German major faced an unspoken dilemma. His earlier statement that Patton would have to kill him to take the fortress had set a psychological constraint on his decision-making. Leaders who publicly define their threshold of surrender narrow their own exit options. For the major, capitulation now risked appearing as a breach of honor in front of subordinates who had heard his defiant message repeated. Conversely, continuing resistance risked annihilation of his men without altering the operational outcome. This was not fanaticism, it was bounded rationality shaped by a culturally specific view of duty. The Wehrmacht officer corps had long emphasized positional honor and the concept of halten bis zum letzten, hold until the last, in fortified contexts. Even if not formally invoked, the idea permeated training and expectation. American intelligence officers, processing interrogation reports and aerial photographs, recognized by dawn that the fortress was no longer a coordinated fighting entity. Indicators included erratic firing patterns, absence of organized countermeasures, and the surrender of small groups attempting to exit through ventilation drains or collapsed trenches. These micro-surrenders suggested that the garrison's morale was not monolithic. The German major's will no longer represented the collective will of his troops. Such divergence is common in late-stage defensive situations. Leaders cling to frames of meaning, while subordinates revert to frames of survival. Morning brought renewed artillery and renewed negotiations within the fortress. NCOs petitioned the major to consider withdrawal into deeper galleries to preserve the wounded. Medical personnel requested ceasefire to evacuate the critically injured, a request the major denied because it risked signaling weakness. His decisions remained coherent within his chosen logic, yet that logic no longer corresponded to tactical reality. The Americans did not need to breach walls to neutralize him. They only needed time and pressure to reduce his audience. By mid-morning, the fortress still resisted, but resistance shifted from organized defense to institutional inertia. In this environment, command psychology overtook tactics. Patton's approach, visible through his willingness to escalate without pause, eroded the psychological space required for negotiated endings. The German major's approach, anchored in personal conviction and cultural precedent, eroded the adaptive space required for rational survival decisions. Both men acted logically within their frameworks. Neither framework contained mechanisms for graceful de-escalation. The outcome, therefore, was not a testament to brutality or heroism, but a collision of incompatible assumptions whose consequences were already irreversible before the final breach occurred.
American pressure on the fortress took a new form as daylight returned. Rather than attempting a dramatic infantry breach, field commanders expanded the perimeter infrastructure that made continued resistance untenable. Engineers established blocking positions behind likely egress tunnels. Artillery units rotated fresh batteries into firing positions, and liaison officers coordinated renewed air sorties once weather allowed. The cumulative message was not one of fury, but of inevitability. Even without visual access to the interior, American officers could deduce that the fortress was moving toward a collapse triggered less by kinetic destruction than by the erosion of its commander's ability to convert will into coordinated action.
The shift in American understanding became most visible in how resources were allocated. Instead of conserving ammunition for a decisive penetration, they devoted shells to methodically degrading access points, ventilation shafts, and external firing slits. These were not targets chosen for spectacle, they were chosen for physiological and psychological effect. A fortress deprived of fresh air becomes a medical problem. A fortress deprived of observation becomes a command problem. Doctrinal manuals do not always emphasize these subtleties, but experienced officers recognize that defenders who cannot breathe or see eventually lose the ability to obey. Within the German position, the loss of these physical enablers produced internal friction. Reports from surviving runners indicated rising temperatures in sealed galleries and growing difficulty treating smoke inhalation cases. The medical station, once organized to handle blast injuries, shifted toward respiratory distress. The major attempted to maintain control by issuing strict orders to keep all outer doors sealed to prevent smoke ingress. But such orders further restricted movement and fragmented the garrison's internal logistics. He had hoped that external destruction would prove the Americans' willingness to expend resources on a minor objective, prompting higher German authorities to issue commendation or encouragement. None arrived. The major was discovering that symbolic stands rarely receive symbolic reinforcement. Meanwhile, Patton's headquarters framed the situation not as a battle, but as an administrative problem requiring closure. War diaries from corps-level staff officers reflect a cool assessment. The fortress blocked supply security and consumed staff attention disproportionate to its tactical value. The solution was to remove the variable quickly. Patton's decision to intensify fires and expedite the end state did not originate from animus toward the garrison, but from irritation with delay. In his view, the German major had gambled that Americans valued negotiation enough to slow down. Patton simply declined to play that game. Observers following the assault noted the curious absence of visible American frustration. Infantry and engineers treated the process as procedural. They fired, repositioned, documented, and waited. The fortress responded with isolated small arms bursts that no longer conveyed organized defense. Among the German enlisted men, pockets of resignation formed. Some reportedly urged their NCOs to signal surrender, others sought escape routes. In Wehrmacht culture, refusal to participate in a commander's last stand posture could be interpreted as disobedience. Yet by September 1944, many soldiers prioritized personal survival over abstract symbols. The major, however, had bound himself to his initial statement. He could not easily revise his threshold without undermining his identity as a commander. The inevitable collapse came not through storming ladders or dramatic breaches, but through a gradual surrender of perimeter elements that stripped the major of his audience. Once isolated strongpoints began raising improvised white flags, American officers accepted partial capitulations without attempting to negotiate for wholesale surrender. This created a tactical paradox inside the fortress. Each micro-surrender reduced manpower without providing the major with an opportunity to declare honorable completion of his duty. He could neither claim to have delayed the Americans significantly, nor halt the process. His framework had no graceful exit ramp. When the major was finally killed, accounts differ whether by artillery fragment or collapsing masonry, the fortress transitioned from resistance to surrender within hours. His death removed the interpretive layer through which orders flowed. Without that layer, the remaining officers and enlisted men reassessed their situation through a simpler lens: survival. Approximately 200 Germans had been killed during the course of the bombardment, and approximately 1,000 surrendered once command cohesion dissolved. American losses were minimal, not because the defenders lacked conviction, but because the Americans declined to convert the situation into a costly infantry assault. The consequences for American planning extended beyond the fortress. The episode confirmed to Patton's staff that defiance could be neutralized more quickly through unrelenting escalation than through protracted negotiation. This insight influenced how certain pockets around Metz were handled in the weeks that followed. The pattern was not cruelty, it was feedback. When commanders discover that accelerating punishment shortens engagements and reduces friendly casualties, they adjust. In this sense, the German major inadvertently taught the Americans how to deal with men like himself. For the German side, the consequences were different. The major's refusal did not alter the strategic picture around Metz, nor did it delay Third Army's advance in any meaningful way. Yet internally, it reinforced within segments of the Wehrmacht the idea that honorable resistance retained value even in strategically hopeless conditions. This interpretation later contributed to the stubbornness observed in fortress battles along the West Wall in early 1945. Decisions made in the confined darkness of one French fortress thus influenced decisions made months later along the German frontier. Leaders rarely intend such ripple effects. They arise when personal convictions are mistaken for strategic signals.
In the aftermath of the fortress's fall, American operational planning absorbed the event not as a triumph, but as a data point about German decision-making under pressure. Intelligence summaries compiled at Corps and Army level noted that isolated commanders, when granted interpretive freedom over vague defensive orders, often chose symbolic resistance over pragmatic withdrawal. This tendency was not universal, nor was it reliably predictable, but it added uncertainty to future engagements around Metz, where multiple forts possessed similar architectural resilience and similar symbolic weight. The fortress incident forced American planners to consider not only how German units fought, but how mid-level officers interpreted their own institutional roles. Decision-making began to account for psychology without proclaiming it as such. Patton's staff, reviewing the timeline, observed that the engagement consumed roughly 12 hours from refusal to collapse. This surprised some officers, who had expected either rapid surrender after bombardment or a prolonged siege. Instead, the timeline represented a middle case, long enough to reveal the commander's intent, short enough to avoid disrupting Third Army's operational tempo. The lesson drawn was subtle. Not every pocket of resistance required patient negotiation. Not every fortress required careful breaching. Sometimes acceleration itself served a strategy. The fortress had demonstrated that refusing surrender did not strengthen the defensive position. It merely compressed the defender's options and hastened the transformation from command-led unit to fragmented survival clusters. Within Allied high command, the episode received little attention. It was overshadowed by logistical concerns, fuel shortages, and debates over the allocation of resources between Patton's Third Army and Montgomery's 21st Army Group. Yet within Third Army, it informed an ongoing internal dialogue about efficient application of force. Patton understood the psychological utility of unpredictability. A commander who escalates without hesitation communicates that defiance carries costs rather than leverage. In campaigns where momentum is strategic currency, such communication has measurable value. However, staff officers recognized an ambiguity. Excessive reliance on escalation might encourage defenders to assume that negotiation was futile, thereby prolonging resistance in other contexts. No formal doctrinal change emerged from this concern, but it lingered in discussions about Metz's remaining forts. On the German side, the fortress incident traveled through informal channels rather than official communiques. Word of the major's stand spread by survivor testimony and field rumors. Some portrayed him as a man who fulfilled his oath. Others quietly questioned the utility of his decision, noting that his refusal neither preserved territory nor inflicted notable damage on the enemy. The Wehrmacht of late 1944 contained both voices.
the traditionalist officer class that valued posture and continuity, and the pragmatic NCO class that valued survival and maneuver. The fortress became a case study in how those values diverged under stress. Historians often attribute late-war German stubbornness to ideology alone, but this episode suggests a more granular explanation. Mid-level officers often fought according to frames of meaning inherited from earlier eras, even when those frames no longer aligned with strategic reality. American analysts reviewing prisoner interrogations recognized this dissonance. Many of the surrendered soldiers expressed relief rather than resentment. Few saw the major's decision as inevitable, some saw it as personal. Several mentioned that they had expected orders to withdraw or surrender once air power entered the battle. Such statements indicated a gap between the professional culture of the officer corps and the survival instincts of enlisted men. The Americans did not interpret this gap as evidence of collapsing morale across the German army. Instead, they treated it as a sign that command decisions would not always reflect unit preferences. This nuance became important as Allied forces moved closer to the German frontier, where defensive doctrine emphasized fortified stands that depended heavily on officer cohesion. The fortress also highlighted the role of communication in shaping resistance. Once the major's death was confirmed, remaining defenders surrendered promptly. This pattern, rapid collapse following removal of key leaders, appeared repeatedly in late war engagements involving isolated German pockets. Operationally, it implied that American efforts to target bunkers and command posts were not merely tactically sound, but psychologically decisive. Organizational psychology teaches that when authority nodes disappear in highly hierarchical systems, collective purpose dissolves quickly. The U.S. Army did not articulate this principle in academic terms, but its officers recognized the pattern and applied it. Unintended consequences emerged as well. Patton's demonstration that refusal accelerated destruction discouraged negotiation in some later encounters. German officers who heard reports of the fortress incident interpreted it to mean that Americans no longer entertained prolonged parleys. For commanders inclined toward surrender, this interpretation expedited their decision-making. For commanders inclined toward defiance, it reinforced the belief that surrender would not meaningfully reduce American aggression. In this duality lies the complexity of signaling in warfare. One message, sent once, can produce opposite reactions depending on the recipient's predispositions. Finally, for the Americans, the fortress episode altered the risk calculus regarding fortified nodes around Metz. Where initial plans favored bypassing and isolating such positions, the incident demonstrated that partial isolation without decisive pressure could prolong German resistance and tie down resources. Subsequent operations integrated faster sequencing of artillery, engineering, and interrogation practices. The fortress thus exercised influence not through its walls, but through the adjustments it imposed on the adversary's planning logic. Leaders rarely anticipate such outcomes. Decisions made in haste to solve a tactical inconvenience can subtly modify strategic behavior, often without formal reflection or doctrinal study. In this sense, the major's stand shaped Third Army's posture far more than it shaped the battlefield.
The fall of the fortress did not end the fighting around Metz, but it changed how both sides interpreted similar situations for the remainder of the Lorraine campaign. American field units, having witnessed the efficiency of overwhelming fires against a static defender, became more inclined to accelerate pressure rather than wait for defenders to reason their way to surrender. This approach reduced uncertainty, but it carried costs in ammunition and fuel at a moment when the Allied advance was already constrained by logistics. The irony was that the most efficient tactical solution in terms of time and casualties threatened the broader strategic objective by consuming resources required for continued movement toward the German frontier. Patton recognized this tension but did not resolve it.
Instead, he managed it through improvisation and requisition, leaving the long-term consequences for others to sort out. For German forces in the region, the incident contributed to a growing recognition that the Americans were willing to expend significant material to eliminate local resistance rapidly. This contrasted with earlier campaigns against the British, who often favored methodical assaults and negotiation when dealing with encircled defenders. Wehrmacht officers who survived the fortress action or heard reliable accounts concluded that surrender might preserve their men, but resistance carried no bargaining value. This realization encouraged some commanders to capitulate sooner in future engagements, though not universally, as ideology and personal interpretation still played decisive roles. The fortress thus functioned as a signal in the complex communication loop of war, where actions, not broadcasts, carried instructional weight. Within Third Army's analytical circles, officers debated what the fortress revealed about German command psychology. Some argued that ideological rigidity was growing within the Wehrmacht as the war approached German soil. Others countered that the phenomenon was uneven and often dependent on individual commanders rather than institutional policy. Diaries and interrogation reports suggested a subtler truth. German officers in 1944 faced a collapsing set of incentives. Their superiors demanded defensive stands without providing realistic means of reinforcement. Their subordinates increasingly prioritized survival. In this environment, a commander could cling to older professional codes because alternative frameworks appeared either dishonorable or undefined. The major's refusal was therefore not merely defiance, it was a refusal to enter a moral and strategic void. American planners considering the larger Metz fortress system confronted an operational dilemma rooted in these insights. The city and its surrounding forts formed a defensive complex with layers of symbolic and historical meaning. If every garrison commander interpreted resistance as a test of personal honor, then Patton's preferred method, rapid destruction through combined arms, would become increasingly costly in resources. If, on the other hand, the fortress incident discouraged similar stands by signaling the futility of resistance, then escalation would function as deterrence. Neither outcome was guaranteed. The challenge lay in predicting how German officers would interpret what had transpired. As battle reports circulated informally among German units retreating toward the Saar, the narrative fragmented. Some accounts emphasized the major's bravery. Others emphasized his mistake. Still others highlighted the Americans' relentless pace. No centralized propaganda apparatus shaped these narratives in real time. They evolved organically through soldier testimony. In such circumstances, meaning becomes unstable. War rarely allows clean lessons. Instead, actors extract interpretations that align with their fears, expectations, and cultural frames. For some German officers, the fortress's fall confirmed that surrender was rational under overwhelming fire. For others, it confirmed that resistance remained the only dignified course. The same event thus produced contradictory behavioral incentives. American officers watching Metz from the outside could not easily track these interpretive shifts. Operational visibility allows one to see terrain and movement, but not belief. A fortress that resists may do so because the commander is stubborn, or because he misreads enemy logistics, or because surrender mechanisms have collapsed. A fortress that surrenders may do so because it has lost its commander, or because morale has fractured, or because the officer calculates that preservation of manpower is more valuable than positional pride. The Metz incident near Moselle revealed how thin the line between these interpretations could be. Strategically, the Lorraine campaign already suffered from mismatched temporalities. The Allies wanted speed, the Germans wanted delay. The fortress centralized these competing temporal logics in a single engagement. Patton's acceleration succeeded tactically, but consumed resources that compounded the logistical slowdown that soon followed. The German major's resistance failed tactically, but contributed to the Wehrmacht's broader strategy of buying time as it withdrew toward the West Wall. In this sense, both sides achieved a portion of their objectives unintentionally. The Americans demonstrated psychological dominance. The Germans converted a futile stand into additional hours of delay. Neither outcome altered the campaign trajectory, but both influenced how subsequent engagements unfolded. By late September 1944, as Allied spearheads pressed toward the German border, planners on both sides continued to reference the fortress incident indirectly. For the Americans, it sharpened the logic of escalation. For the Germans, it sharpened the logic of selective surrender. For historians and analysts, it stands as an example of how decision-making under pressure produces consequences beyond the tactical map, consequences that emerge not from doctrine alone, but from how human beings interpret uncertainty, obligation, and risk in conditions where information is incomplete and time is short.
The fortress episode gradually receded from the operational foreground, yet its implications continued to shape decision-making in the final months of 1944. American planning circles increasingly treated individual German commanders as variables whose choices could not be reliably predicted from institutional doctrine alone. This was a departure from earlier assumptions that the Wehrmacht operated with unified purpose. Analysts within Third Army began to describe German resistance in terms of clusters, pragmatists, traditionalists, and ideologues, though these labels were heuristic rather than formal. Such categorization reflected a growing recognition that battlefield psychology had fragmented within the German officer corps, and that this fragmentation could both shorten and prolong engagements depending on circumstance. Patton's own reaction to the fortress was consistent with his broader philosophy. He had long argued that wars should be prosecuted swiftly and without sentimental regard for defensive symbols. To him, the major's refusal did not represent courage or madness. It represented obsolete thinking from an earlier strategic era. In staff briefings, he reportedly cited the fortress as evidence that German officers trained in positional doctrines would continue to fight even when positional war no longer made sense. This was not meant as ridicule, it was a prediction. Positional logic dominated the First World War and continued to influence interwar military education across Europe. The major's decision was thus not an aberration, but a residue of a previous strategic paradigm. The German military system, for its part, did not uniformly celebrate the major's conduct. Surviving officers from the Metz region wrote after the war that such stands often reflected personal interpretation rather than institutional necessity. They noted that higher command rarely mandated suicidal defense unless the position held strategic terrain. In cases like the Moselle fortress, the decision to fight to destruction usually originated from local initiative. Post-war memoirs from German officers involved in the Lorraine campaign sometimes expressed admiration for the major's resolve, but questioned its utility. Their critique was pragmatic. Meaningful delay required survivable withdrawal, not annihilation. Yet at the time, few were willing to articulate this openly. The collapsing strategic situation encouraged silence, and silence allowed symbolic decisions to masquerade as tactical logic. Among American units rotating through Lorraine, the fortress developed a reputation less as a cautionary tale and more as a procedural lesson. Infantry platoons recounted the experience not in emotional terms, but through practical observations. Air power suppressed fixed defenses, artillery disrupted communications, engineers sealed escape routes, defenders surrendered when command cohesion collapsed. These observations filtered into after-action reports and influenced how similar strong points were addressed during the slow advance on Metz in late autumn. The result was not doctrinal innovation, but procedural refinement. In complex operations, refinement often matters more than innovation. This refinement, however, produced an unintended contradiction at the strategic level.
Third Army's demonstrated ability to collapse fortified pockets through concentrated fires validated Patton's philosophy. Yet each such collapse consumed ammunition, fuel, and time that contributed to the broader slowdown of the Allied advance. The fortress incident therefore illustrated an irony. The tactical logic of overwhelming force could undermine the strategic logic of rapid exploitation. Patton understood the tension, but maintained that delay caused by negotiation or maneuver would have been worse. The validity of this assertion remains debated among historians, but what matters in context is that the fortress reinforced his confidence in his own method at a moment when other Allied commanders questioned his priorities. On the German side, the fortress also created interpretive tension. Some officers drew the conclusion that Americans would not negotiate meaningful terms with isolated defenders and therefore accelerated surrender decisions in similar situations. Others interpreted the same information differently, believing that refusal would provoke American overreaction and thus buy time for higher formations to reorganize. Both interpretations appeared rational under conditions of uncertainty. The divergence reveals how signals in war rarely function as intended. Messages become data points filtered through pre-existing beliefs rather than objective instructions. The fortress became such a data point. The psychological fate of the fortress's garrison underscores a further complexity. Most of the approximately 1,000 surrendered personnel survived the war. Their testimony contributed to Allied understanding of German morale and command cohesion in late 1944. Yet for German historians after 1945, the Major's decision remained difficult to contextualize. It was neither fully heroic nor fully senseless. It belonged to a transitional period in German military culture, when formal obedience intersected with informal codes of honor, and when officers trained for decisive maneuver found themselves defending indefensible fixed positions. In that dissonance lies much of the war's tragic texture. In retrospect, the fortress episode illustrates the unintended consequences of local decisions. A single commander's refusal to surrender had no operational impact on the Lorraine campaign, yet it shaped American perceptions of German resilience, influenced resource allocation during the siege of Metz, and contributed to evolving German attitudes toward surrender. It demonstrated how decision-making under pressure can produce effects that radiate outward, altering behaviors and expectations far beyond the tactical map. Leaders rarely intend such radiating consequences, yet wars are full of them. The fortress was one more reminder that in modern conflict, outcomes emerge not only from plans and doctrines, but from individual interpretations of duty and survival in moments when neither side possesses complete information.
American and German analysts reflecting on the Lorraine fighting after the war often viewed the fortress episode through the lens of institutional learning. It offered no dramatic heroism and no strategic revelation, yet it illuminated how decisions made under pressure become signals interpreted by multiple audiences. Patton's decision to accelerate destruction rather than negotiate set a precedent for how Third Army dealt with fortified resistance around Metz, validating a style of command that prized speed and pressure over delicacy. The German major's decision to refuse surrender reflected a professional identity shaped by older positional doctrines and cultural expectations of officer honor. Neither man acted irrationally. Each made choices that aligned with his understanding of duty and war at that moment. Their collision produced an outcome that neither fully controlled. This outcome reveals the limits of intention in wartime decision-making. The Americans intended to clear a tactical obstacle quickly. The Germans intended to preserve honor by delaying the enemy. The Americans achieved speed, but consumed resources that contributed to the broader operational slowdown in Lorraine. The Germans achieved only a marginal delay, but produced an interpretive signal that shaped attitudes toward surrender among officers elsewhere.
Such outcomes demonstrate that coherent tactical decisions can generate strategic ambiguity. War rarely punishes illogic alone. It often punishes logic applied outside its optimal context. The fortress also highlights the role of information scarcity. The German major believed the fortress's symbolic value would deter a full-scale assault because in earlier contexts, North Africa, Italy, such symbols had influenced Allied restraint. He lacked visibility into Patton's operational priorities and into the evolving American approach to fortified positions. Likewise, the Americans misread the major's refusal as temporary bravado rather than as a binding public commitment. Their assumption followed from statistical patterns of surrender. His behavior followed from personal interpretation of duty. This mutual opacity created a situation in which escalation was not the result of hatred or ideology, but of two rational frameworks failing to recognize each other's internal logics. Psychologically, the collapse of the fortress after the major's death underscores how hierarchical military systems rely on individuals to translate abstract duty into concrete action. The fortress did not fall because its walls were breached. It fell because the interpretive function that linked garrison to meaning disappeared. This effect recurred throughout late 1944 and early 1945. German positions that resisted stubbornly under determined officers often surrendered rapidly once those officers were removed or incapacitated. American tactics adapted accordingly, targeting command infrastructure not only for operational reasons, but for psychological ones. German behavior adapted as well, as officers increasingly weighed the implications of being cut off from relief or reinforcement. Neither side formally articulated this adaptation in doctrinal language at the time, yet it manifested in patterns of surrender, resistance, and collapse across the final months of the war. For historians of command psychology, the fortress incident offers a case where context mattered more than ideology. The German major was not a fanatic. Patton was not acting out of cruelty. Both were professionals shaped by different strategic eras, operating under incomplete information and constrained timelines. Their decisions reveal the intersection of institutional memory, personal identity, and situational ambiguity. These intersections generated consequences that extended beyond the earthworks and galleries of a single fort. Some consequences were tangible: altered procedures, shifting morale, resource expenditure. Others were intangible: signals interpreted unevenly across units, narratives that shaped expectations, lessons embedded informally into the culture of command. The strategic significance of the fortress was modest. Metz did not fall because of it, nor did the German retreat accelerate or slow materially. Yet the episode captured the paradox at the heart of modern warfare. Decisions that appear logical at the local scale can produce outcomes that are irrelevant, counterproductive, or symbolically potent at larger scales. The Germans fought, the Americans pressed, and the war moved on. What remains is not a tale of victory or failure, but a record of how two commanders confronted a moment in which surrender and destruction carried different meanings, and how their choices sent ripples through a system already strained by exhaustion and uncertainty. In the end, the fortress near the Moselle stands as an illustration of constrained rationality under conditions of pressure. The German major died believing he had honored his duty. Patton moved on believing he had maintained operational momentum. Both assessments contained truth, and both omitted consequences neither man intended. Modern observers can map the trajectories that followed, but they cannot smooth the discontinuities that defined them. Those discontinuities between intention and outcome, between logic and context, remain the enduring tension at the center of wartime decision-making.